We used to say there's no chance that we're going to have a Cold War 2.0 between the U.S. and China. I don't think people are so certain that that's not the case anymore.
On that point, I found your talk fascinating this week for many reasons, but one of the standout takeaways for me was just that this is the one issue that both sides of the political divide in the US are united on: China.
Now, we presume, for historical reasons and because of Joe Biden's relatively low approval rating and the amount of inflation, that the Republicans are going to get the House. And now what the House can do, even though without passing legislation, the House can hold hearings. And what the House has said they are going to do, and the Republicans have said, when we get the House back, we are going to have hearings against companies that are doing business in China. We're going to have hearings when companies send their leaders to go meet with the leader of Hong Kong. We are going to have hearings about this. We are going to name and shame companies that are engaging with China, because all we hear in the United States, again, this is Republicans talking, and maybe some Democrats too, but say, oh, all we hear is about ESG and how you're so focused on environmental social governance and you want to save the world and it's all about world capitalism. Yet at the same time you're telling us this in Washington, you're going to meet with sanctioned individuals in China and Hong Kong, and in all there, it's all about making money, but in the U.S. it's not. You can't have it both ways. And that's what you're going to see with a Republican-controlled House that you wouldn't necessarily see with a Democratic-controlled House. So it doesn't matter if the Republicans get the House and Senate. If they just get the House, you're going to see a lot of change on rhetoric when it comes to U.S. and China.
And you mentioned one point there, which was the some Republican lawmakers now want to make sure that U.S. banking leaders don't meet with John Lee, the new head of in Hong Kong, the new chief executive, because that is going against some sanctions. And yet, at the same time, Biden will likely meet with Xi at some time in the coming future, maybe at the G20, for example, or possibly even meet with Putin. So where do they draw the line on who can meet who if the business leaders are just trying to go to Hong Kong, for example, in this case, the banking leaders, and keep business going?
Well, okay, so and what makes Hong Kong very difficult when it comes to for businesses is when the U.S. sanctions an individual or the U.S. sanctions a country, and the U.S. sanction, who does the U.S. normally sanction, right? They sanction Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. There's not a lot of business in those countries. Right. And so business leaders don't have to worry about the appearance of doing business or negotiating with those countries, because there is no business to get done. Now, what's happened in Hong Kong is that, when John Lee was the head of security for the Hong Kong government, the U.S. government sanctioned him personally, right? Because they said that he was involved in implementing the national security law, and he was involved in coercing, detaining, or imprisoning individuals who were just speaking up against the Chinese government. So he is individually sanctioned. He's now the leader of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the home to hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of U.S. companies, and then certainly tens of thousands of people working for those companies. So now, all of a sudden, you are dealing with a sanctioned individual. It is legal. The sanctions apply that you can't give that person money, you can't give that person goods, you can't give that person services. But if he's hosting a conference and you go to that conference, arguably you're not violating U.S. sanctions law.
Okay.
But are you giving the impression that that he is a good person, he's okay to do business with?
Right.
And so that's the dilemma that U.S. companies have to deal with today that they never had to deal with in doing business in Hong Kong.
What are your clients telling you about how they're going to handle it?
Well,
or do they know yet?
No one knows yet. I mean, when I worked for UPS, and certainly when I worked for UPS, of course we met with the leader of Hong Kong. It wasn't even a question back then. When I worked with UPS, we met with the leaders of China. That wasn't a question back then. Our goal was to try and get those meetings, try and advance business, try and, bring engagement between the countries and development. And then, of course, it was to make money. I mean, that's what businesses do. You didn't have to think about those things. Now, if you are, a CEO of a U.S. company, what's going to happen if you meet the leaders of China or Hong Kong? You're doing business there. It's legal to do business there. You want to do business there. It's a very important market. You want to serve the Chinese people. But we are in uncharted territory when it comes to doing public affairs in Asia. And what the Biden administration is saying in its national security review, that China is our number one competitor for the next decade. And when you have the national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, say that we need to contain China because we, the United States, need to keep our superiority when it comes to supercomputers and AI for as long as possible and as deep or as far a lead as possible. It's Glenn, you can't answer that question yet because it's all new right now.
Yeah, but that's the fascinating point, Steve, because it's uncharted territory. I mean, putting on your McClarty Associates hat for a second, a Singapore-based American company comes to you and says, we've got this deal lined up with Hong Kong. What do we do? And second point, what are the possible ramifications? That's where it seems very gray to me.
And that's what you have to think through now. And this is the same thing that governments are thinking through now, right? Where you have the Singapore government and the leaders of the Philippines and Malaysia, everywhere in Indonesia, they say to the U.S. government, don't make us choose between the U.S. and China. We want to be able to engage with both the U.S. and China. We want to have business between the U.S. and China. We want to have investment and trade flowing between us and the U.S. and us and China. Well, global businesses say the same thing, right? We want to be able to do business in China. We want to be able to do business in the U.S. We want to be able to engage in both. But that is getting more and more difficult. And so this is a real balancing act that the U.S. government needs to think about. What is it going to do vis-a-vis its relationships, in particular with ASEAN? And then U.S. companies need to do the same. The U.S. government used to take the view, and Glenn, this is the difference, right? What U.S. businesses do and what the U.S. government does from a national security perspective are basically two different things, right? Of course, you have Joe Biden fist bump, MBS in Saudi Arabia. You wouldn't expect to see a CEO necessarily fist bump MBS in Saudi Arabia. That's the government and business, two different things. But national security and economics and business are becoming one and the same.